Okay, so use your ruler, line it up with the edge. You won't be using a fat pen, you'll be using a nice pencil. And I'm following my edges. I'm actually using the inside edge of that blue line. And because this is curved, I'm doing dot to dot and moving the ruler. And I'm extending my center front all the way down through the seam allowance. A lot of you are going to get to the point here where this is in kind of a nebulous zone, and I find a lot of people take this and curve it down or curve it up, but it needs to be parallel to the seam allowance, and it needs to be a right angle right here. So that will affect your neatness grade. Always a right angle, always parallel to the seam, no curving up or down, because then when you try to sew it, you'll have this little point down here at the waist, and if you're sewing in your skirt to it, it will push this down and create some wrinkling down below in the skirt. So right angle, smooth curve. No seam, because this is going to be on the fold, and when it's on the fold, you don't want to have extra seam, or you'll have to put a seam here, or you'll end up with too much fabric there and wonder why it doesn't fit right. So no seam on a fold. Happens all the time. If you turn one in that way, I'll leave you a note and have you fix it and resubmit it so you don't lose points, because people just forget. So do your best and I'll give you feedback. Okay. Right angle again, I'm lining this up with the bottom edge, and I'm making this corner a nice right angle to begin with. And I've kind of got the paper at a odd angle to me because the tripod is here and it's my new friend and it has to be everywhere I am. Okay, so I've got seam allowance all the way around. Do I have another pen color that I can use for seam allowance? I know I do. So I could use a highlighter for this. Okay, well, we will just stick with the blue. I would rather have you plan ahead and leave room around your piece on the paper like you would have to do in a work setting, and put your seam allowance on in with a highlighter or a pen, than have you glue the paper on. Gluing the paper on is good in that you get lots of extra practice cutting, because you'd have to cut this piece out and then you'd have to glue your yellow paper on, and then you'd have to add your seam allowance and cut that piece out. But the important thing is that you keep track of where your seam allowance is when you get started. Later on, you actually will be able to think with the seam allowance sometimes and just work with the outer edge. But that takes a few years or a lot of sewing experience. So in the rest of the videos, I'm not going to color the seam allowance in with you. And if you want to go ahead and use the glue method, because this isn't as pretty. The gluing the seam allowance on is a lot prettier, but it's kind of more like scrapbooking. So this is part of the seam allowance. It disappears behind there. And this is also part of the seam allowance. It disappears behind. You'll want to measure that exactly, so I need to set a good example and measure that exactly. Well, imagine that. My pen is so fat, I have to trim off a little bit. Okay, there we go. It's like watching marker dry. But try to be extra neat. I shouldn't try to go extra fast because I don't want the video to be long. I need to do it nice and neat so I can set a good example. In a work setting, you don't color your seam allowance in, and you don't glue it on. You just draw it on and write down how much it is. Mark the corners so that anybody picking it up will know how much the seam allowance is. Okay, so that pattern piece is almost finished. You need to put your name on it. Front bodice. I abbreviated it to FT. Shoulder dart. It would be smart to put the page number on, but I'm not looking at a page, and if you want to be creative and move it to someplace a little bit different, you can. But do label it size 8. Okay, so now I'll cut it out. This is where your cutting practice comes in. And it's really important to have the edge of the seam be nice and smooth, because that's where your stitching line starts. If the seam allowance is jagged and you get it to the sewing machine, then you can't necessarily tell exactly where the stitching line is supposed to go. So the edge of the pattern is where you measure the seam allowance from when you're on the sewing machine. So you want to cut it out really nice and neatly. And at my first pattern making job, when I was through with college, I had an internship at Pike Manufacturing, and they went out of business in the late 80s when the trade agreements changed. All of the sewing factories on the Wasatch Front went out then because the sewing happened in China instead. But we had 8 sewing plants between Logan and Provo, well past Provo. Anyway, the reason I brought that up is that we had German and Italian pattern makers that worked there. And the lady that I worked most closely with was German. And she had an accent, and I really liked her. But she would come up and pick up my patterns and run her finger around the edge to see how smooth my cutting was. And if it wasn't smooth, she would have me cut it over. So it's the edge of the pattern piece that's important, making it smooth. Because even if you have a squiggly line drawn here, if you've got a straight one here, it ends up being sewn straight. And back then, all of the patterns were cut out of more of a cardboard texture, a heavier. We had to use special scissors because it was cardboard. And they would take these and put them on the fabric and trace around them and figure out the markers from that piece. So it was important that they were heavy and that they were cut neatly so that as the pen went around the edge of the paper, the cutter could cut it out nice and smooth because the edge was nice and smooth. So we've got our dart folded the right way, name on it, and then we'll just take a glue dot. I don't want to put glue up here where I'm folding it because you want to remember where that goes, and you can take notes and put them on this page if you want to. But I'm going to put a single glue dot to hold it in place for in my book, and I think I'm going to actually move it toward the center. That would look better. So I'm just going to hold it still in case for some reason I need to take it off. And that picture that I drew, I don't want my dotted line down the front, so I'll draw another one. And you'll print out the ones that are on canvas that have the bust point marked, and you'll just draw a straight line from the corner to the bust point and the corner to the bust point. And there's a review of that on Canvas on the assignment page that Maria has done. And she's the teacher that teaches the advanced class. So you'll want to put that somewhere, and if you want to write any notes there, you can. And then it will go in the page protector and be finished. So that's how you do the seam allowance, and why you do it the way you do, and where the right angles are. And I will probably go through all 5 of the ones on the video. You can keep watching the YouTube videos, or you can just watch the ones that are attached to the assignment on Canvas.